As a result, Australia is also at war.
It is feared that the Prime Minister has drowned.
He has misled the Parliament.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia podcast.
Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up the day is a bum.
I will not be lectured by this man.
Why won't you call an early election?
Mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
With your host, John Ruddick.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia, Episode 7, Captain Arthur Phillip. Last episode, the British Cabinet on the 19th of August 1786 made the momentous decision to send the First Fleet and to try to beat Captain La Pérouse of France to Botany Bay. This episode, we look at the preparations for the First Fleet and introduce the Royal Navy officer entrusted to make the huge investment in money, manpower and national honour pay off, Captain Arthur Phillip. In 1620, the Mayflower, carrying 102 English pilgrims, came ashore at Cape Cod, Massachusetts. That moment is celebrated as the birth of modern America. Perhaps something like 1 in 20 Americans today are descended from those first pilgrims. The Mayflower was not a government initiative. To the contrary, the devout pilgrims were fleeing state-sponsored persecution. The First Fleet was the beginning of British colonisation of Australia, and it was a huge, centrally planned operation that brought men and women to the end of the earth with half in chains. At this time, Australia and New Zealand were often referred to as the Antipodes, an ancient Greek term meaning that if you're standing somewhere on the earth and then drill a hole directly down and keep drilling directly down until you go through the core of the earth and come out at the absolute opposite of where you were standing, that place is your Antipodes. In a geographic sense, Australia isn't perfectly antipodal to England, but it tells us what the English thought of New South Wales at the time. It was the end of the earth. So, to nation build at the end of the earth, First Fleet planning was a massive logistical and administrative operation. Margaret Cameron Ash describes it as the most expensive peacetime operation in the history of Britain. David Hill wrote of the First Fleet, "Never before or since has there been an experiment quite as bold as this." Over the prior 3 centuries, there had been around, say, 300 to 400 attempts by Europeans to kick off an overseas colony. Perhaps as many as 40% were either abandoned, collapsed, or with time considered an error. A thriving colony had endless upside, but a failed colony was a pit of human misery. Christopher Columbus's second voyage to the New World, way back in 1493, had been the largest of these attempts, but the size of the First Fleet trumped Columbus, and Columbus's first attempt at colonisation devolved into an awful mess. The meticulous planning invested into the First Fleet resulted in a superior outcome. But as we'll see in coming chapters, the early colony had acute challenges in the first few years. Let's compare the scale. As we have seen, when John Byron sailed for the South Pacific, he had 2 ships and a crew of 250. Samuel Wallis had 3 ships and 256 crew. Louis Bougainville had 2 ships and 330. James Cook had just 1 ship and 94. La Pérouse had 2 ships and 225. The First Fleet? 11 ships with 1,500 aboard. This wasn't a half-hearted attempt. It was an all-of-government nation-building initiative. When the British had been transporting its convicts to America, the process resembled slavery. Once guilty, the government washed its hands of a felon. Convicts were brought by a private ship owner who then sailed a cargo of convicts to America, where they were then on-sold to a farmer who got 7 years free labour before they, unlike slaves, were free. New South Wales was to be very different. It would be a government-run, industrial-scale, open-air jail. The correct maritime term was probably more like the First Squadron or the First Convoy, but First Fleet rolls off the tongue nicely, so we'll stick with convention. And obviously it wasn't referred to as the First Fleet at the time. But the plan was for this initial fleet to be a trailblazer for many more. That, of course, depended on the first being a success. Once the decision had been made, the first thing to do was to get the finance in place. Home Secretary Lord Sydney wrote to the Lord Commissioners of the Treasury with a, quote, heads of plan for the disposal of convicts to New South Wales. It read in part,
"The several jails and places for the confinement of felons in this kingdom being so overcrowded a state, His Majesty has been pleased to signify to me his royal commands that measures should immediately be pursued for sending out of this kingdom such of the convicts as are under sentence or order of transportation. His Majesty has thought it advisable to fix upon Botany Bay. It may not be amiss to remark in favor of this plan that considerable advantage will arise from the cultivation of the New Zealand hemp or flax plant. Most of the Asiatic productions may also, without doubt, be cultivated in the new settlement.
The official line was that the First Fleet was about convicts, convicts and convicts, but there were other upsides around flax, timber and agriculture. After losing the long war against the Americans, the Treasury was not flush. But regardless, the First Fleet was given a blank cheque.
Expense not to be considered,
was the official policy. The project was an in-your-face intrusion into the domain of the East India Company, who, as we saw in episode 5, had a claim on all British trade in the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. This monopoly had been granted via Queen Elizabeth way back in 1600. The East India Company was arguably history's largest commercial enterprise. At times, its private army had twice as many soldiers as the British Army, making it a textbook example of crony capitalism, which requires government favour to eliminate competitors. Alexander Dalrymple led the East India Company's crusade to convince the government to back away from this foolish plan for Botany Bay. We first met Dalrymple when he was initially selected to lead the endeavour, but Dalrymple was then unceremoniously dumped and replaced by Lieutenant Cook. As we saw in episode 2, Dalrymple became an employee of the East India Company in 1752. He spent most of the next 5 decades as a fiercely loyal company man. In 1786, when the Cabinet decided to launch the First Fleet, Dalrymple was a London-based senior executive of the Grand Company. Perhaps Dalrymple had long harboured bitterness about all things New South Wales after Cook returned and was acclaimed an imperial superhero. Perhaps Dalrymple had been muttering ever since, "That should have been me, not that low-class Cook." Now that is speculation. What's not speculation is that Dalrymple was tipped off about the Cabinet's decision almost immediately, because only 15 days later, Dalrymple published a 56-page pamphlet entitled "A Serious Admonition to the Public on the Intended Thief Colony at Botany Bay." Dalrymple was on a mission to strangle the First Fleet in its cradle. It's borderline comedy. His opening lines were,
"As the public, in general, may not be aware of the consequences which are threatened by this rash and ill-advised plan of the Ministry, it shall be my endeavour to explain the matter. This project has, under various forms, been for several years in agitation, although some of the motives assigned are so absurd that it is scarcely credible they could have been assigned."
Dalrymple threw every argument at the First Fleet, ranging from the East India Company wasn't even consulted, as it always had been about matters in its domain. It was unlawful for the government to take away property granted via the Crown. Britain can't afford it because of the national debt. It's cheaper to keep convicts in England. The Dutch had a 2-century claim on New Holland, plus it also mapped the East Coast recently. Now that was fake news. Other places around the Atlantic were more suitable for convicts, and Cook had described Botany Bay as sandy, rocky and swampy. But for my favourite anti-First Fleet argument, let's return to Dalrymple's own words.
"The plan the Ministry proposes must rather be considered as encouraging than deterring felons, for what is the punishment intended to be inflicted? Not to make the felons undergo servitude for the benefit of others, as was the case in America, but to place them, as their own masters, in a temperate climate where they have every object of comfort or ambition before them. This will incite men to become convicts, that they may be comfortably provided for."
So, got that? Dalrymple is suggesting that New South Wales will be so much fun that non-criminals in England will commit a crime just to be part of the fun. His desperation was understandable. For almost 2 centuries, the East India Company had shipped a ton of European stuff to Asia and a ton of Asian stuff to Europe. It brought serious wealth to Asian merchants and to the shareholders of the East India Company. Days after Dalrymple's attempt to KO the First Fleet, Lord Sydney politely but firmly wrote to the directors of the East India Company. His lordship played the royal card.
Concurrence would not only please His Majesty, but will be a means of preventing the emigration of our European neighbours into that quarter, which might be attended with infinite prejudice to the Company's affairs.
When talking to the men of money, the government put the convict spin aside and talked Turkey. Hey, if we don't build a base there now, someone else will, and that will cost you money. So there were grumbles, but 6 days later the East India Company gave their gritted consent, although they did get a ban on New South Wales trading with Asia. The bitterness lingered. 8 years later, the chairman of the East India Company described the colony as
the serpent we are nursing at Botany Bay.
But behind all this bluster was an admission. New South Wales had huge potential, and the East India Company knew it. With the finance locked in and the East India Company defanged, the massive administrative task of preparing the First Fleet swung into action. All T's would be crossed, all I's dotted. The success of any colony could never be guaranteed, but Whitehall was determined to maximise the chances of First Fleet success. Notices appeared in newspapers. Ships, supplies, crews, officers were all needed. The public was soon buzzing with First Fleet fever. The Royal Theatre put on an opera entitled Botany Bay, continuing until the evening before departure. The English have always had a generally fond view of Australia. That sentiment took hold from the outset, but there were critics of the project, and partisans took their sides. A Tory MP told Parliament the decision for Botany Bay was
beneath the disquisition of reason and below the efforts of ridicule.
A cartoon captioned the first Parliament of Botany Bay mocked the plan with drunken louts and bodies hanging on gallows. An unfounded rumour circulated that the Dutch had formally objected to the British plan. But the project had more fans than foes. Books were written to cash in on the hype. A 44-page pamphlet appeared entitled A Historical Narrative of the Discovery of New Holland and New South Wales. It stated,
the determination of the British government to establish a settlement in the southern Pacific Ocean has strongly excited the public curiosity, as it is a very natural question. What national benefit can arise from such an establishment? When we consider the number of populous islands in the Southern Ocean which have been visited by the British flag under the auspices of our most gracious sovereign, the importance of a permanent settlement in that part of the world, in order to continue the friendly intercourse we have already had with the inhabitants, as well as to enable us to enter into some commercial connections with them, will immediately appear to the mind of every intelligent person.
That likely sold well because soon after, a book 6 times longer appeared entitled The History of New Holland from its first discovery in 1616 to the present time. A second edition flew off the press soon after. Its opening lines were,
the plan adopted by the British government of transporting criminals to Botany Bay has been for so long the subject of popular discussion that every information relative to a country so extraordinary and so little known, it is presumed will be acceptable to the public. With regard to the scheme itself of forming a settlement in that country, every reader of every description is from the publicity of the subject already in possession of innumerable arguments touching its probably advantages or disadvantages. But the future existence of such a colony is by some regarded as a visionary event, and deprecated by others as the probable source of unhappiness to the parent state.
Clearly the public were gripped by the project. As the planning was in full swing, the London Times reported that the whole thing had been called off.
The Botany Bay scheme is laid aside, as there is a strong presumption that a squadron from Brest in France are now, or soon will be, in possession of the very spot we meant to occupy in New Holland.
Historian Alan Frost argues that this was a government leak to mislead the French. He's probably right, but it could have been a last-minute dirty trick by the East India Company to turn public opinion against. Either way, as far as the British government was concerned, the First Fleet was unstoppable. The real foe was not domestic, it was foreign. Margaret Cameron Ash described the decision to send the First Fleet as tantamount to a declaration of war on France. That chapter of Anglo-French rivalry will be explored in the next 2 episodes. Lord Sydney was the British government's Home Secretary, an odd title for a cabinet minister responsible for the colonies. Sydney had decided almost immediately to appoint Arthur Phillip as the supremo of the First Fleet. When Lord Sydney suggested Phillip, the First Lord of the Admiralty, i.e. the top dog of the Royal Navy, replied,
"The little knowledge I have of Captain Phillip would not have led me to select him for a service of this complicated a nature."
But Lord Sydney got his way and the King made it official, issuing Phillip his commission to command the First Fleet, just 8 weeks after Cabinet had made its decision to go. A fortnight later, Phillip's role was upgraded. He was also to serve as the Governor of New South Wales. Phillip would repay the favour by naming the infant settlement in honour of his patron, Sydney Cove, and as Sydney Cove grew, the name shortened to Sydney. Joseph Banks was more worthy of the naming rights, but Banks, unlike Sydney, would have been a somewhat confusing name for a great city. So, who was Arthur Phillip? We can piece together quite a lot about Phillip's life, but there are vague chapters, and like Cook, we do not know the inner man well. We know little about his religion, politics, romances, hobbies, or what was on his bookshelf. But we can piece together a diverse career, and all those pieces came together and made him a good choice to make the New South Wales punt a winner. Arthur Phillip was born in 1738 in London's East End. He was a Cockney, which in the parlance of Sydney and Melbourne today means he was a Westie. Phillip's family were not as poor as Cook's, but they were far from rich. His German-born father was either a language teacher or a sailor, or both. It's unclear, but his father likely died when he was young and the family hit hard times. Aged just 9, Phillip got a bottom-rung labouring job on a warship. Britain was a class-ridden society in the 1700s, making it difficult for a Cockney to get ahead. But as we saw with Cook, a career at sea was levelling and rewarded talent. At 13, Phillip enrolled in a charity school for boys who wanted a career at sea. Entry required a family member to have either been killed or wounded in the service of the Navy. Phillip's entry may have been via his mother's first husband, or it may have been his own father. Following a couple of years of maritime schooling, Phillip began a 7-year apprenticeship in the Merchant Navy, where his ship chased whales in the icy north and traded along the ports of Europe. 18 months into the apprenticeship, Phillip quit and joined the Royal Navy. It was mid-1755, the 7 Years' War was brewing, and enlistment was ramping up. 17-year-old Phillip began his career as a captain's servant, a trainee officer. James Cook, you will recall, started lower as an ordinary seaman. During the war, Phillip served in the Mediterranean and wrote to his sister about the thrill he got from a naval battle. But 2 years in and Phillip was discharged for poor health. By 1760 he was back in the Royal Navy, enjoyed a few minor promotions and served for 2 years in the Caribbean, partaking in sea battles plus the land-based siege of Havana. The Caribbean exposed Phillip to the reality of colonisation. The French, Spanish, English, Dutch and the Danes all had Caribbean slave colonies at this time. Phillip was later ahead of his time in opposing slavery. It's quite possible the cruelty he saw at this time is the origin of his enlightenment. The 7 Years' War concluded in 1763. Phillip had reached the rank of lieutenant, but the Navy was demobilising and, unlike Cook, who was one of the few who was retained full-time, Phillip was partially discharged on half pay. Phillip, now 24, then married a seriously wealthy rural landowning widow. She was 17 years his elder. They would have no children, and no joy it seems, as they separated, maybe divorced. 5 years later, and thanks to a prenup, Phillip left with none of her money. For the first half of the 1770s, Phillip spent most of his time in France. Admiralty records indicate he was still on half pay and was abroad to recuperate from poor health. Seems like a long time to be overseas and getting paid to get better. In the next decade, Phillip was definitely working as a spy in France, and so it seems likely this vague French sojourn in the early 1770s was also a spying mission. Phillip was fluent in multiple languages, including French, and so that, his olive complexion and discretion, would have helped him blend in. The alternative view is that his ex-wife's wealth was made from the textile industry, and while in France he was using skills she had taught him to make money in the bustling cloth-making towns of northern France. He does appear to have prospered at this time, and he would soon buy his own farm in England, but that doesn't explain the half-navy pay and the documentation he was unwell. Phillip's life ambition, however, was to be an officer in the Royal Navy. At one point he hurried back to England in the expectation war was about to be declared on Spain, but that crisis was averted and disappointed, Phillip returned to France. With Britain at peace, Philip's naval career was on hold. He then had what appears to be a lucky break, but it too begs questions. Britain and Portugal have had friendly relations since way back to 1386. Both hated Spain, so it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend thing. In August 1774, Philip was asked by the Royal Navy to do a stint with the Portuguese Navy, where he would be promoted to captain and paid twice as much as Portuguese officers of the same rank. The British told the Portuguese Philip was intelligent, with high ability and sound character. He sailed for the Portuguese capital Lisbon in December 1774. His secondment would last 4 years. Philip wasn't part of a delegation of British officers lent to the Portuguese. This was a solo mission. And the mission clearly had some importance. At Lisbon, Philip was granted an audience with King Joseph I. So he was up to something, and both the British and the Portuguese were in on it. But what it was precisely is not entirely clear. War was brewing again between Portugal and Spain. The flashpoint was a border dispute between Portuguese Brazil and the Spanish port of Buenos Aires. Philip was sent to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Philip served with distinction, and his proximity to the nitty-gritty of colonial administration would come in handy in the next decade. In particular, his observation of Portugal's active policy of exiling convicts to Brazil. Michael Pembroke has written a highly readable and the most modern biography of Philip. He argues the British engineered his role in the Portuguese Navy so he could be a sleeper spy and chart the coastline of South America. He would gather intel on Spanish-dominated South America, where the British had been unwelcome. Maps in this age were the keys to empire. When Philip later returned to England, he brought with him the most detailed maps the British had of the entire continent. Philip was well liked by the Portuguese authorities, in particular the Viceroy, i.e. the colonial boss of Brazil, who said of Philip,
"He gives way to reason and does not fall into those exaggerated and unbearable excesses of temper which the majority of his fellow countrymen do, more especially those who have been brought up at sea, saying what he thinks but without temper or want of respect."
After 4 years, Philip was honourably discharged from the Portuguese Navy and returned to England in September 1778. He carried a message from Queen Maria I of Portugal, who said Philip had overperformed, but that she could not refuse his request to rejoin the Royal Navy. She also recommended he be promoted. In 1778, Britain was, of course, in the thick of the war with their rebellious colonies in North America. That should have opened opportunity for Philip to be promoted. But back in the employ of the Royal Navy, he was still only a first lieutenant. His pay again seems to alternate between half pay and full-time pay till the end of the war. Captain Cook had risen fast and far in the Royal Navy. Philip's career has the hallmarks of an ambitious but frustrated plodder. France, Spain and the Dutch had joined with the Americans in their war against Britain, so Britain was gripped by fear that their continental enemies would invade the homeland under the fog of war. The Royal Navy therefore patrolled the English Channel during the war, and Philip was second in command of a ship of 600. It was far more boring than being on the front line in America, especially since the invasion never materialised. In September 1779, Philip was promoted to master and commander of a ship, but that ship didn't end up sailing. More frustration for Philip. But he was now being increasingly consulted by the top decision makers about his knowledge of South America. Besides Brazil, Spain controlled all of South and Central America, and Spain was fighting with the American rebels against Britain from 1779. So Britain needed to access Philip's on-the-ground experience in that part of the world, plus his valuable maps. There is an insightful chapter that either happened at this time or earlier when he was in the employ of Portugal. The story goes that Philip was captain of a ship carrying troops and a couple of dozen convicts from Rio de Janeiro to Buenos Aires when a severe bout of seasickness hit the crew, putting the ship at risk of going down. Some say the emergency was not caused by sickness but by a severe storm. Either way, needing all hands on deck, Philip made the risky decision to unshackle the convicts and get them to work to save the ship. That was an opportunity for the convicts to mutiny. But Philip's charm worked, and instead they did their duty, and the ship made it safely to shore. When they arrived in Buenos Aires, Philip recommended their sentences be quashed or reduced as thanks for their efforts. Some were freed and given land grants. It's possible this story is mere legend, but it did appear in the British press as the First Fleet preparations were underway. Word would have gotten around among the convicts that their governor wasn't too bad of a bloke. He had faith in the rehabilitation of convicts. Just before the end of the American Revolutionary War, Britain concocted an invasion of Spanish South America. Philip was so involved, it was referred to informally as Philip's Plan. He had impressed Lord Sydney and now had a powerful patron at the heart of British power. His luck had finally turned, it seemed. 3 ships were to sail to Spanish South America, conduct some raids to cause trouble for their enemy, and then sail on to the Spanish Philippines to cause more trouble, and then onto a friendly British port in India. Philip was captain of one of those ships who sailed off in January 1783. This was his first role as boss of a Royal Navy ship with 600 aboard. He was 44. The other 2 ships in the convoy, however, were damaged in a storm soon after departure and returned home. Philip's sailed on. When he arrived in Rio de Janeiro, Philip learned a peace treaty had just been signed. Philip had a big chance to excel in war, but again was denied frontline action. But Philip's ship was fully supplied, and so they sailed for India, where Philip spent a few months. We know next to nothing about what he got up to there. But when he returned to England in April 1784, Philip was now one of the most travelled sailors in the Royal Navy, despite having seen little live action in war. On his return, Philip either became a spy or resumed his spying at the direction of his patron, Lord Sydney. Spying in the 18th century was mostly mundane, walking around in a foreign land, blending in, looking at stuff, overhearing gossip, and reading local newspapers. A record from the Colonial Secretary's Secret Service ledger confirms a payment of £150
to enable Captain Phillip to undertake a journey to Toulon and other parts of France for the purpose of ascertaining the naval force and stores in the arsenals.
And other parts of France for the purpose of ascertaining the naval force and stores in the arsenals. Philip's spying in the south of France confirmed that yes, the French Navy was building up rapidly during this interval of peace. He returned to England in October 1785, but 2 months later was off again for another 12-month spying stint in France. He would, however, be recalled earlier to lead an important mission of paramount concern to the King and the Cabinet. Join us next time as Arthur Phillip and his First Fleet sails for Botany Bay. Or is it Sydney Harbour?
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Political History of Australia podcast with your host, John Ruddick. Click follow to receive episode notifications, and leaving a review helps others find the podcast.